Hi, welcome to our companion series to our study in the book of Daniel. Each one of these digging deeper videos is going to help equip you and hopefully inspire you to jump into the text a little bit more yourself. So just as a recap, my goal is not to try to walk through the text and exegete or explain all that's going on. I want to give you some good questions to ask and maybe some tools and motivation to work through Daniel chapter 2 on your own. So last video that we did for Daniel chapter 1, we talked about the importance of observation as just a big bucket category, and in particular, observing some of the structure, recognizing that the Bible is divinely inspired literature. Both are true. It is divinely inspired. It's from God, but God used various authors through various times of history to express accurately in a divinely inspired way that content that he wanted to share with his people. And so it is also literature, and there's a lot of different types of literature. We talked about how Daniel was both narrative. It has some history, not exactly in the way we would cast it, but history mostly to support the narrative. It's got prophecy in it. It's got some poetry and some sections we'll see today. Daniel chapter 2 kind of mashes together a lot of these different literary types. Hopefully you've read it and you've watched the message on it already that we broadcast. I'd encourage you to check that out if you haven't. It's going to help a lot as we come to the study today. So as we talk about Daniel chapter 2, it does have narrative. It's got this sort of poetic prayer that Daniel gives that's a break apart from the text. And then you have this interpretation of dream that's got these prophetic elements to things that are to come with some maybe bizarre or unusual imagery that needs to be interpreted. And then we come back to narrative. In fact, it follows kind of a similar, when we're talking observing the structure of the text, kind of follows a similar arc to chapter 1, where there's a setting, what's happening. Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. There's a tension point. He wants both the dream to be recounted for him without him telling his advisors. Then he wants it interpreted. That creates a big fallout because they're frankly just ill-equipped and unable to do something like that. And then Daniel takes action. Okay, so we have our saying and our action where he asks for time to pray. He prays. God reveals the dream to Daniel. Daniel goes and shares that dream. Then we get to this section that shows this prophecy about what is going to come in the future. And as kind of a conclusion or result of those tension points or the action points of the story, that Daniel and his friends are rewarded and elevated for their service to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, as you're studying through this, I want to just give real briefly a couple of things to keep an eye on as you go through the text. These are ways to help us observe better, not just the high arc story of it was a bad situation, Daniel prayed, God showed up, everyone was happy. Okay, but there's a lot more happening than that, and so let's take a closer look. A couple ways to do that. One, just ask some basic kind of investigative questions maybe you learned in writing in school, right? Who, what, when, where, and why. So asking these questions of the text as we go through it is going to really help you slow down and start to ask some really important questions that are going to reveal some things that we want to keep an eye on and we want to meditate on. So it could look something like this. Like you finish Daniel's, the first paragraph, and you're asking, who are these advisors to the king? And why exactly are they so blown away by Nebuchadnezzar's ask? What is it that they typically would have done? And how is it going to work out now that he's made this new level of demand? When you're trying to really come into the characters and understand them or the situation or the phrases that are being said, it's going to really help you start to observe things really well. Not only just asking basic questions, check out anything that's an emphasis or a repetition. A lot of times, authors throughout lots of different types of genres and frankly throughout history have used points of emphasis, either where the story crescendos to maybe this key speech, or there's something that's said over and over again, or it's a conclusion and here was the moral of the story, right? Whenever you hit those emphases or repetitions, keep an eye on them, because a lot of times they're going to give you a clue or a key to what are some of the heartbeat of the chapter. For example, Daniel chapter 2, the word mystery comes up 8 times. 8 times. If I said something that many times in a few paragraphs, right, you'd start to go, either he doesn't have a good thesaurus, or, right, he really wants us to know what's going on. Interestingly enough, not just the word mystery, but if you consider the whole semantic range, where are all the words that are connected with that word or that concept, right? You've got knowledge, you have hidden, you have revealed, made known. You've got all these things that kind of fit within this bigger bubble of there's things that are not known and there's a God who makes it known. That actually gives us kind of an interesting perspective on what some of the major concepts are of this chapter. So a major concept in this chapter is mystery and God's ability to know it. That's even the primary tension with the original counselors, right? When Nebuchadnezzar wants to know this, they go, no one has ever asked this. Who could possibly know that? Shifting the scene, here we come to Daniel. So those sorts of things are going to be important for understanding what's going on under the hood of the text, where your attention as you're observing should be drawn. Basic questions, emphasis, repetition, keywords and phrases. This may be a little bit more intuitive, but if there's those kind of moments where things really stand out as a key section, this chapter 2 is very interesting because you have narrative and some interpretive dreams, and it touches in the prophecy side of things. But as you're going to narrative, you all of a sudden take this huge break and you hit this sort of poetic, almost song-like prayer structure that David gives. It's a sudden change of pace in the text. So from this story, some type of poetry or prayer, and then you go back to story, and again, some prophecy in there too. But it's characteristically different. It's highlighted. And so it's something that you'll want to take note of and observe. And in fact, this whole poem that says, blessed be the name of the God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings. He sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. And it goes on. That section is actually one of the key texts for the whole book. That affirmation of a God who sets up kingdoms and tears down kingdoms, of a God who knows mystery, of a God who reveals mystery. Those are some of the core teachings about God that the book of Daniel has to offer. It answers some of the questions that we see raised, or the tension points throughout the story, throughout this book. It's set apart and as a key word, phrase, section, and that really should draw our attention. And not just for this chapter, that actually applies to all chapters within the book. But that highlights, that's really critical for us to understand, particularly as we get to the dream interpretation later in this chapter. Basic questions, emphasis or repetition, kind of keywords, phrases, passages. Number 4, look for comparisons and contrasts. Seeing how these things develop really can be insightful. So what is the comparison and contrast between the Chaldean or the magician advisors to Nebuchadnezzar versus Daniel and his friends? That's an interesting comparison and contrast to make that bears out some fruitful study. Secondly, how does God reveal himself to Nebuchadnezzar, to the Chaldeans? Compare and contrast that to how God of the Bible reveals himself to Daniel and his friends. So when you're seeing these similar situations that are held up against each other, first of all, take notice of that. They are intentionally meant to be compared and contrasted. The author's trying to get you to see the difference. You need to see that difference and ask the question, who, what, when, where, and why. Particularly why? What is so different about Daniel or his God, or the way he's interacting with this God, versus the Chaldeans and their pantheon of gods, and how those gods are responding to them? that comparing and contrasting. The author's intentionally doing it. Make sure to keep an eye on that and be recognizing that as you study. I also want to talk about cause and effect. Okay, so we've got basic questions, emphasis, repetition, keywords, comparisons, contrasting. Fifth, cause and effect. There's kind of a bit of a cutesy phrase sometimes you'll hear when you talk about Bible study. When you see the word therefore, ask what it's there for. Okay, when you see the word therefore, what that should signal for you is the author is trying to say, because of what just preceded, because of what happened before, this is now going to be the result. Because of the cause that was just written about, the effect is this. So whenever you see that, take a step back if you don't already know and go, what was the cause? And then how do we understand the effect? And that can really open up some amazing things as you study God's Word. For example, let me read you just a section from Daniel chapter 2. Then there's our kind of, key word that should be highlighting, stop and recognize cause and effect. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and his companions. Verse 18. And he told them to seek mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Verse 19. Then, there's our word again, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision at night. Then, there's our word again, Daniel blessed the God of heaven. There's a very clear pattern of cause and effect that's happening here. Because of the tension of Nebuchadnezzar, that's one cause, you've got the whole situation with the counselors and their inability to answer. Because that's going to sweep up Daniel and his friends, he goes and pleads for time to ask God for revelation. Then we get to our passage we just read. Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to his friends and companions and told them to pray and ask God. After they pray, they take time to stop and they pray. Then God reveals the dream. After God reveals the dream, then they praise God. Now think about that sequence of events. It should trigger our basic questions here. Why in that order? Why in the first place was it that Daniel even had to hear about it kind of through the rumor mill here? Why wasn't he there in the room? Why did God wait to even give him the interpretation of the dream until he spent concerted time in prayer and meditation? Why didn't God just reveal it? What does that say about God? What does that say about the importance of prayer and meditation and how God tends to operate? And then this is fascinating, right? Cause and effect. God reveals the dream after this prayer, meditation, crying out to God. Then Daniel praises God, cause and effect. God reveals, Daniel praises. Notice what didn't happen in that sequence of cause and effect. He didn't know that his life was going to be saved. Daniel did not go and tell the king. The king confirmed, yes, you got it right down to the detail. Wow, Daniel, you're so amazing. Here's a promotion. None of that had happened yet. Daniel actually was praising God simply for the fact and his faith that God had come through and would continue to come through. He was not withheld until he saw all the effects of that thing play out before he was willing to respond with a heart of praise and trust and faith in God. That should tell us something about how Daniel, as this hero figure, as exemplifying the life of faith, has a lot to say about what we should be doing in our lives. Cause and effect. Watch these things in the text and process through what that means. Lastly, and this is one's really tricky. It's not that there's not more points to this. This is what we're highlighting today as we observe. The last thing I want to say is, what is missing? What is missing and why does that matter? Most of us aren't very good at this because, like a magician who keeps your attention over here while he does something over here, we're just drawn to the activity and we don't tend to follow other things that are in the background. For example, did I happen to move something that was in the backgrounds of this video that is no longer in the background as I'm filming today? Maybe. You might want to pause and go back and check, see if you can find out what it is. Now, it's something slight, something small, but most of us aren't good at tracking all the things because we have limited attention spans and capabilities and, all these different reasons, we tend to follow the key thing. But it's important to ask what is missing, because that can be really fruitful. That's not true of just the Bible, by the way. When I read a book that someone's proposing an argument, saying forth a philosophy, I almost always will read the last chapter first. It's a terrible plan in a mystery novel. It's really good when you're reading something about an argument or a philosophy being put forward, because I want to know what the conclusion, and then I read the book and see if all of your arguments are being developed in such a way that they accurately connect and bridge to that conclusion. Is there anything conspicuously missing? Is there something that you should be saying or talking about that you haven't said and you're just glossing over with a fun story? So that's important in a lot of different types of literature. And when we come to the Bible, it's not because we think God's trying to do a card trick with us, but it can be telling to know what is missing from the text. A great example of this, what is conspicuously missing in this text, is the God of the Babylonians. When you would just stop and think, how would this play out? A king wants an interpretation. Why doesn't the king pray to the gods? Why don't the gods reveal something to the king? What about those who call themselves, the professional interpreters, magicians, Chaldeans? They say the only reference to the God that's made from the people who both worship and professionally pray to and do all these things for the cult religion of Babylon, the only reference made to their gods in this entire thing is their absence. The only reference is made to the absence and the fact that the gods don't come down and dwell with men like that. That should be conspicuous in our mindset as we're observing. It's absent, and that further frames the both power and might, the wisdom, knowledge that the God of the Bible is being shown through Daniel, is being shown through this text. Okay, so there's a comparing and contrasting, even though it's not explicitly being said because one element is missing, but that very fact actually should highlight some really amazing things about this chapter. All right, as we wrap up, you've got some great tools to work with as you're reading through the chapters. So I want to just close with just a couple of questions to maybe cue up some thoughtful conversation that maybe the story or the theology of this raises for us, that you can have some kind of discussion points on your own. How does God show up and to who? That's a great question. God shows up to Nebuchadnezzar in this, and he shows up in a dream, and that's different than probably most of us are used to hearing how God reveals himself. What about that surprises you, and how does that fit into your larger framework of how God communicates and to who God communicates? This is a good question. What can I know about God through the dream as it is written? Okay, so this dream we talked about is obvious, the progression of powers within the world until it ultimately comes to a point where God comes in, erases all these man-made structures, and his kingdom will last for all eternity and cover the whole earth. But what do all these different pieces mean? Do these refer to different phases within the Babylonian progression until that empire collapses? Is this other empires from Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, Rome? How do you interpret the different elements? There's a lot of things to be said and explored in this here. Lots of commentaries are written on it. But God actually doesn't give the exact interpretation of what all these things mean, which again should be conspicuous. So what can we know? We do want to study more and see what all those individual elements are, and I encourage you to. But what can you actually know about the theology that God is teaching through the text as it is written, even if you don't know what exactly iron corresponds to in the later succession of rise and fall of nations and kings? What can you know about that? What does that teach you? And what does that whole passage imply about God's role in the rise and fall of nations? This is a challenging question. Let me encourage you to take it out of kind of an abstract history. What does that mean about the Persian Empire? Okay. For a lot of us, that's pretty abstract and removed. Maybe ask it in this way. What does that part of the chapter imply about God's role in the upcoming elections in November? Now that's a different question, and it's actually the same question, but it feels different because it strikes us in a more personal way. That's a great question to entertain over your next coffee cup with a friend. And then lastly, God is the revealer of mysteries. Why does he choose to reveal this mystery to these people at this time? And for the people of God who are reading this account over various generations. Why does God choose this? And then compare and contrast that. There's mysteries that all of us have in our life that we've asked God. I mean, what's going to happen to me in a few weeks? What's going to happen to my family in 6 months? What's going to happen to our country, right? All these questions that God knows, but God most often isn't revealing that. Why? What is God's purpose in Revelation, and how may that be the same or different in our expectation or desires of Him? So just a few questions. There is a lifetime more. Scripture is like a diamond that has so many facets with it. There's always something new to discover. God is always revealing Himself in unique ways through it. Let me encourage you to dig in this week to Daniel chapter 2, ask some really good questions, and may God bless you richly for it. Thanks so much for checking in, and I encourage you to join us again for digging deeper in Daniel chapter 3.